A so-called tainted blood victim from Coventry is calling on the government to fairly compensate the thousands of victims who've contracted diseases like HIV and hepatitis from contaminated blood transfusions in the 1970s and 80s.
An estimated 4,670 haemophiliacs given transfusions from imported blood contaminated with a range of viruses. Andy Bevan reports.
In 1987, Britain woke up to the dangers of AIDS, although its long-term effects were still unknown. The virus, we were told, could be passed on through infected bodily fluids, including blood. Haemophiliacs like Joseph Peaty from Coventry, who lack the clotting agent which stops a simple cut from bleeding for days or even weeks, were well used to regular transfusions of blood plasma created from a small pool of 4 or 5 donors. But in the 1960s and 70s, big pharmaceutical companies switched from small donor groups to large ones, some as big as 60,000. They sold this cheaper-to-make mix, known as Factor 8, to customers around the world, including the NHS. Haemophiliacs started to contract hepatitis, and many put it down to their use of Factor 8 products. Then, in the late 1980s, the devastating discovery that haemophiliacs all over the world, including thousands in Britain, were also infected with HIV. Joseph Peaty was 19 when he was diagnosed.
Life just fell apart for me because we were told that we'd only got a few years to live. And for many of my friends and colleagues, that proved all too true. They died, and over the years now, there's 2,500 roughly haemophiliacs that have died from these infections. There's an awful lot of empty seats at Christmas tables this year.
As far back as the Second World War, it had been noticed that injured soldiers who were given blood transfusions often developed hepatitis and other infections, so the risks were well known. In the 1970s, American donation centres paid people for their plasma instant cash for down-and-outs, alcoholics and drug users. Joseph Peaty and his campaign group say the Factor 8 producers and governments, including our own, knew there was a risk of infection in their blood plasma, but they carried on making and using it anyway. The group, Tainted Blood, has been pressing for a public inquiry into the affair for decades. Successive UK governments have said no. Last week, Coventry MP Geoffrey reminded the Commons that the Prime Minister had made a pledge to look into possible compensation for haemophiliacs within 6 months. Nick Clegg, standing in for David Cameron, agreed that the 6 months were now up and things needed to move on.
The Prime Minister's promised to come back by the end of the year and to offer them some more definite, comprehensive settlement. That's the clear impression he left with the victims themselves. They're looking to him to honour that promise.
Next month, an inquiry by the Scottish Parliament into the use of contaminated blood will present its findings. The Penrose report could leave Westminster with some awkward questions to answer, stretching back more than 50 years.
There's an abundance of evidence about what they did know beforehand, and what they could have done in terms of precautionary measures, but they didn't take those steps, and they still maintain that there are no lessons to be learned.
The Department of Health told ITV News, in 2011 we announced a package of measures to provide more support for those affected, but we know that some people remain unhappy with the current system and we're looking carefully at what more could be done. In the meantime, this daily routine goes on for thousands of haemophiliacs, fighting deadly infections they were given in something that was supposed to keep them alive. Andy Bevan, ITV News.